Right. Well, welcome everybody online and in person. I should get my in-person camera going. Yeah, Carol for now.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. We got Ben and Tina on the other side of the table, just in case you're wondering who's in the room. So I sent out today these sheets, two-sided. One side says book 2, and I've given it a particular outline. And then on the back page, book 3, and I've just listed the chapter titles. So I just thought that might be an easy way for us to talk about things. So I thought we would just start. There's a lot of chapters that we covered. So I think we had 3 chapters from book 2 and then 12 chapters from book 3. So there is not a hope that we are going to touch in detail something from all of those chapters. So I just thought that I would point out one thing about our book 2 stuff. So I laid it out this way because Lewis is actually approaching his theology in quite a classical way. And I just, because he's saying things with such big, broad brushstrokes, I didn't want to miss that he's actually touching on some really important topics. So, of course, we have had his treatment of God, and we have creation in there. In chapter 2, he talks about the fall and the presence of evil. In chapter 2, he also touches on Israel. Now, he does that in a super broad brushstroke. And really, he just says, you know, how does God reveal himself? He does it through the special people and recounting their history of God hammering them. And that's the Old Testament, right? So, but again, it's there because a lot of Christians don't have Israel at all. They skip right over Israel right to Jesus. So the fact that he has that is significant. And again, as part of our creed, remember back to when we did the King Jesus Gospel, and Scott McKnight pulled out the 1 Corinthians 15 and the way that sort of forms the basis of our creed and gives a summary of Paul's gospel. Everything that Jesus does is according to the scriptures, which would be the Old Testament. So Lewis does a good job, and I just wanted to kind of commend him for that. And then, of course, he does talk about how it all narrows down to the person of Jesus as that perfect penitent. And then he has eschatology as well in chapter 4, and the church, right, between Jesus and eschatology. And so he does talk about the church in chapter 4, but then, of course, book 4 itself is also about the church. So I just want to make sure that we noted that kind of a structure is there. And if you went to some of the systematic theologies that I have on my shelf, you would see that similar kind of structure, right? With some other stuff. So was there anything in book 2 that you wanted to talk about that stood out, that needed some clarification, that you had a problem with? Or?
I can't find it at the moment, but he developed one very long apologetic based on a statement that I didn't think was accurate in the first place.
Okay.
But I can't find it now.
Okay.
Because you can't write it on that.
Okay.
But I'll keep looking because I may.
Do you have a sense of what it was?
No.
Okay.
It was.
It's okay. I just thought if you had some idea, then we might be able to narrow it down for you, but that's all right. Others? Something that I didn't talk about last week, but I wanted to point out with the invasion, where he talks about Satan in the place of evil. Did you notice the parallels between what he had to say and the White Witch in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe?
Mm-hmm.
That foreign prince that has invaded the good creation and usurped the rule. That's the picture of the White Witch in Narnia, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's not a dualism, but rather it's an enemy occupied territory. I like the way he says that. And again, which is why when Aslan comes, when Christ comes, there's a level of anarchy that occurs, right? Because there's an established rulership as being overthrown, and in order to establish a new kingdom, and even though it's the rightful kingdom, it's still anarchy, it's still an overthrow, especially since we have all been citizenized into the old kingdom.
I think sometimes when I listen to some people, they sort of equate the power of God to the evil one.
Right.
Right. Like
yes.
Even some of the kids as friends, like,
yeah,
I'm either worshiping God or I'm worshiping Satan, but they sort of almost equate that they have the same
yes
level versus
yes.
understanding that one
yeah.
is over the other.
Yes.
I don't know.
Which plenty of Christians do as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
They do embrace a certain level of dualism.
Yeah.
And sometimes that comes out of a theology about God that says, it rightly recognizes God is not the author of evil, but there's a certain amount of desire to defend God, right? So we don't want to say that God is powerless. We just want to actually exalt the other powers so much that maybe God is neutralized somewhat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those that don't want God to have anything to do with evil.
Right.
In any way.
Yeah.
Like it had to spring from something else.
Right.
Because it couldn't touch God.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it looks like the two forces are the same.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Then, of course, we have the shocking alternative. And the discussion of freedom of the human will. That's really key for a lot of people as to where evil comes from and why God made us that would enable us to be evil in the first place, right? So is this a tactical error on God's part? And Lewis's answer, and I would agree, is no, that because God desires love to be freely given, and in fact, that's kind of to properly love, it must be freely given, right? Therefore, freedom must be given, and with that freedom comes the risk of failure. So really important. And I really liked, and it's similar to what I've talked about under the shocking alternative, how he, even though he does discuss morality coming up here, he says we got to be careful that we don't frame it in that term all the time, that in itself is imagery. So I really liked when he said God made us, invented us as a man invents an engine. A car is made to run on petrol and it would not run properly on anything else. Now God designed the human machine to run on himself. So you may have heard me emphasize in certain times and places that God's presence is our source of life. And so as we leave God, as we hide ourselves from God, we are also fleeing life. And that's why sin equals death, because sin is the fleeing of God, which taken to its natural end is the ultimate rejection of God. And then we foolishly think all I want is life without God. But it's an absurdity, it's an impossibility, because God himself is life. We don't have life independent of him, no matter how much we think we've unplugged ourselves from the source. and we're just running on batteries now.
Mhm.
So I appreciated that.
Which makes sense when people struggle to love recklessly and with abandonment, when they're stuck to keeping God in the rules and check boxes.
Right. Yes.
Like
yes,
I'm not
yes.
sure, he's not hiding in that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
He's out in the
Yeah.
wild.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Although even, I just want to be careful there, because the things that we pick up as rules are things that, for example, the tree in the garden, he says, don't eat of that tree. That will bring death. All the other trees are for your blessing. So that prohibition is itself a blessing to the human couple, right? To humanity. And we can reduce it to a rule and say, oh yeah, must not eat that tree. And Eve does that, right? She repeats back to the serpent and she's added to it. She's expanded on it a little bit. But really what that rule was pointing at was the direction that life flows and the direction that flows away from life, right? So when God says, don't eat of that tree, when God says, have one spouse, whatever it is that God says, it's not so much that he's just picked an arbitrary rule and said they have to come up to scratch, but rather, how does life flourish, sourced in God? How does the world work? And I think, again, Lewis points to that, right? So we can move with the grain of creation or against it, which is with the grain of God himself and his presence or against it. But I agree with you that we can get so caught up in the rules that we miss the fact that often they in themselves are pointing to the larger reality of living life according to the presence and direction of God, right?
I think just missing those opportunities that like we're so focused here
Yes.
and passing us by.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Our circumstances, people, and opportunities
Yes.
where love is needed.
Yes.
And
yes.
how can I just step in?
Because we've turned it into an operational manual.
Yes.
And we've just said, oh, flip to page 42 and here's the instructions. And
rather
absolutely.
than just trusting. And
I
don't know what's going to look like. Might be messy.
That's right. Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. You also see the rehearsal that we talked about, Professor Kirk in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, about logic, right? Either Lucy is crazy, or she's lying, or she's telling the truth, right? There's a limited number of options that can be happening. Now, Lucy is not typically a liar. She's a truthful person. And so you shouldn't consider her a liar until you have some very good reason to change the opinion, some evidence. It's clear she's not mad because she has described something that has logical coherence to it. And therefore, she must be telling the truth. So at the end of the shocking alternative, he says, basically, Jesus claims to be God. Now, if he's just a good teacher, just a human being who's a good teacher, that leads people to believe that he is God, then he's not a good teacher, right? That's evil. If you're not God, you lead people to believe in you as God, then you are creating an idolatrous situation, leading people away from the truth. There's no way that you could call that good or a good teacher. That would be evil. So it's not evil. We've concluded, most people conclude when they listen to Jesus, oh, he's a good teacher. So what he teaches then cannot be a lie. So he's not lying. Is he crazy? Does he think he got? No. Nobody treats him as crazy. Nobody tries to kind of put him away. So then he must be who he says he is, which is God in human flesh, right? So it's the same kind of logical argument. Now, there have been people that have pushed back against Lewis's argument, given some different options. But I just wanted to kind of draw that connection between logic and the way Lewis is approaching this whole thing. We get some atonement theories, which I thought was pretty good in The Perfect Penitent. One of the things he said, I'm doing a lot of talking, but that's because you guys aren't jumping in. One of the things he said that I think is really important for us to catch is this pushing back at dividing God. And it's a classic, I think it's from the medieval time of the church. The idea that there's this God in heaven who's angry and wrathful at humanity and just wants to smite him, destroy him, send them to hell and cook them forever kind of thing. And the Son, who is compassionate to the human creature, says, oh no, hit me instead, Dad. No, I'll take it kind of thing. And so the Son and the Father are at odds in terms of motivation. The Father wishes to curse the world, the Son wishes to save the world. And the Father, as long as I get to hit somebody, then we can go ahead with this plan.
But that's not rational with the concept of the Trinity.
Right. So I'm describing an older theory of atonement that was very popular and still has some followers. And I'm pointing out the absurdity of it and commending Lewis for doing the same.
It's kind of refreshing and interesting that he kind of says there's more than one. I'm not sure you understand it when you accept it, because I think we've tended to kind of boil it down. And I don't think we'd have many Christians who'd say, well, I'm not quite sure I'm quite clear, or there's a lot of different. Like, I think we kind of got it down to boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
And that's sort of...
He seems to be using a great deal of logic to say that we can't ever know.
Yes.
Yeah.
He clearly says that.
Yeah,
he says,
like
we know that it works, but nobody can actually say that we have speculation about how it works, but we don't know.
Yeah, like we keep on eating, even though we can't describe how that keeps us alive.
Yeah.
But he's taking everything so infinitesimally apart to produce this. You just can't know.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of work.
Well, and I think, again, we got to keep in mind his audience. So he's speaking to the general public, and his goal is to introduce a mere Christianity. So in some ways, backing away from particular tribalism, right? And of course, one of the things that marks different denominations is a denomination's attachment to one particular atonement theory. This is what happened on the cross. So I think a part of what he's doing is just saying, okay, a lot of you, because I mean, Britain is a post-Christendom, non-Christian country, but it's a Christian country, right? So everybody grew up with it, but nobody really believes it. So it's a cultural embeddedness. And so in some ways, I think he's having to disembed some of the culture to say, now, you've probably been a part of a church. They've probably had a real lock solid, this is what it is. It could be, and there's probably some truth in that, right? Like, I mean, even that kind of ridiculous caricature that I just described, while it's not true, there is something about substitutionary atonement. Jesus does stand in our stead. There is the wrath of God poured out on the cross and not on all of humanity. But the Father and the Son are one in terms of intention and purpose. This was the intended action this was God's plan from the very beginning, right? So Jesus is the Lamb of God that was slain before the foundation of the world. So this is not plan B. This has always been plan A. So I think that's in part what's happening, is he's having to do some disembedding work and be able to say, you know, we don't need to, in a John Wesley type of way, we can be charitable with each other on these speculations as to how the atonement works, how it accomplished what it accomplished, but we can all have complete Catholic unity, small c Catholic unity on that it works, right? And committing ourselves to it without fully understanding just how it works is the key to it all.
Mhm.
We lost Bob.
He's not sure about the atonement.
There'd be lots. I think we kind of locked it down to like the prayer, the evangelical prayer now. And I don't think there'd be lots who would even talk about different atonement theories or.
Right, right.
It's kind of striking from the normal lay
Yeah.
thoughts around that.
And that can be problematic too, right? There is something, I mean, evangelicals, that is a focus of evangelicalism, to say, you can't just say, I trust the church, you know, whatever the church believes, I'll sign, you know, kind of thing.
Mhm.
There does have to be some level of processing and embracing of one's own self, right? And that's where some of the pushback comes. So you don't necessarily, we don't need to draw knives and stab each other over which atonement theory you have. But at the same time, you can't just say, oh, I'm a Roman Catholic and therefore I'm okay, right? And you also can't say I'm an evangelical, so I'm okay. There has to be some personal investment. So I always like Dr. Dewey, my first theology prof, would say, you know, years ago, there was a man who stretched a wire across Niagara Falls. And he says to the crowd, do you believe that I can cross this wire? And some, sure, you know. And so he gets up and he has his pole and he does it and he comes back across, all tremendous applause. And now do you believe I can go across this wire? Oh yeah, you can do it, you can do it. Do you believe I can push this wheelbarrow across the wire and back? More, yeah, okay. But still some, I don't know. And he does it, he comes back, oh yeah, now do you think I can? Yeah, of course you can do it. So who will get in a wheelbarrow? Right? So we can know that Christ died and died for me, and somehow my making him my Lord and Savior, or confessing him as Lord and Savior, my subjecting myself to him, does it, but there has to be that element of real subjection, right? We have to get in the wheelbarrow. It has to be more than just a cognitive, I know this. It has to be, I'm reposing my trust in this person. So it's the aspect of belief and trust, which then of course means belief and obedience. It's not just beliefism. Ain't Wednesday nights great? Get to talk about this stuff. So Jesus as the Israel and the Adam does as the God-man for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And as we are incorporated into Christ, we reap the benefits of what he has done. So that's kind of where Lewis gets with the end of the perfect penitent. And I really liked his discussion on those who would say, oh, it's not fair, Jesus was God, then doesn't count kind of thing. And I thought, it's a really good, I thought he made a credible argument to say, well, of course we need somebody that has the advantage that we don't have to do this, just as we have the teacher who, forms the letters with the child and for the child in order for the child to learn to do it themselves.
The guy standing on the bank with one foot. I thought I like that one.
Okay.
I'm going to refuse your saving.
Right.
An unfair.
Yeah, it doesn't count. You're anchored to the bank.
Unfair.
You gotta get into the water and drown with me.
Yes, and then maybe say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, you guys know I talk about Lewis often enough, so how much I appreciate him. So we go through to the practical conclusion.
Okay, so this is the spot, a spot
Okay.
where I'm just not sure. He says we have baptism, belief, and the sacrament, the Lord's Supper,
Yeah.
as the three
Channels of grace.
Yes.
If we were to use Wesleyan language. the
Yes.
Grace
So
channels.
He says the Methodists want more belief than they want sacrament.
Yeah.
I would put baptism and communion in one corner because I have a pretty sacramental understanding of baptism and communion,
Yeah.
whereas I have more of a participatory understanding of belief.
Okay.
So I don't really see them in the same ballpark.
I think you might be framing them differently than he is.
Yeah, okay, so if you can help me understand that, because I read that through and it just
Yeah.
made me angry.
Well, just remember that he's Anglican, so he's sacramental. He's probably more sacramental than you.
Probably, yes.
Um,
So I tend to think it would be hard to, but anyway.
But
Yes.
so the Catholic Church had 7 sacraments, and
Still do, I believe.
sorry,
Still do.
right? Yeah. Although they do recognize marriage is kind of in the if column because they recognize that not everybody is called to marriage, and if something is a sacrament, then it ought to be available to all. But if you're a priest or a nun, anyways. So I think that he's kind of doing a similar thing again to John Wesley that says these are grace channels. And I think we would want, if we had the opportunity, and one day we will, to be able to ask him, what do you mean by belief? Because I don't think he means just cognitive knowledge. I think that probably involves things like the word, again, because usually it's word and sacraments are put together. So I would think that it's teaching, doctrine, word, that he's holding up again as a grace channel. Yeah. And he might agree with you that the Lord's Supper and baptism are of a particular set or species. He might also see what comes next is in between those, right? So the baptism as the entrance right into the church, belief, and then the Lord's Supper, right? So those 3 working together. Just personally, I won't get too tied up about it.
He does go on to say, I cannot myself see why these 3 things should be the conductor.
Yeah, yeah, and others.
Well, I can see very good reason why baptism are conducted.
Right, right. Well, and again, maybe you are more sacramental than him. Maybe he's more rational.
He does come on, yeah.
But again, I've talked about it before in sermons where I talk about it as strange gifts for peculiar people, right? Like we eat bread, we drink juice. We have somehow encountered the real presence of the body of Christ and his blood, and we participate with him in that. Why? And why those,
Mhm.
only God knows, right? So I think to some degree, water has some sense, right? I mean, water is usually related to cleansing. So, but it's also that the act of baptism is not only incorporation into Christ, but it's incorporation into Christ's body. It's just what God chose and joined on us.
I think I always would have learned or thought of baptism as an evidence, an outward evidence of an inward.
That's a fairly evangelical way to describe it. That moves away from a sacramental view of baptism. So if we were to go to Romans 6, Paul says, as many of you as have been baptized, and the implication would be that's all of y'all, you have been united with Christ in his death, in his burial, and therefore in his resurrection. So coming through the revivals in the 50s and the rise of evangelicalism, a lot of people have viewed baptism through a rational lens, right? We don't look at it through a spiritual lens. And so baptism becomes, you've made a choice for Jesus, let's say. And so now you just want this, you want to provide outward evidence. I'm declaring outwardly what the decision I've made inwardly. So sacramental, and like the way Paul's describing it in Romans 6, it's far more about what God does. Somehow, when you go under the water, you are joined with Christ in his death, in his burial, and in his resurrection, which then becomes the foundation for the rest of Paul's argument that it's inappropriate to do these other things that, in light of that, because you've joined him, and to join Christ and then do these other things would be inconsistent. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And there is a level of truth to this is an outward thing. So it is declarative of a reality that you are declaring Jesus as Lord. So when Paul says in Romans, if you declare with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord and God has raised him from the dead, then you are saved, right? That's a baptismal confession. So that's in part what you're doing there. You are making a public witness, a declaration of your faith. But that doesn't change in the same way when you two got married, there's a spiritual unity. You are now not two individuals, but you have become one flesh, even though you remain two individuals, but you are married. There's something ontologically new and real as a result of your vows to one another before God and to God in the front of the congregation. So your marriage vows are probably the best kind of example of what the baptism is. Same sort of thing.
And it kind of makes you think, like, when you declare, you're really, I don't know, maybe I'm thinking it wrong, but you're declaring it's for other people's sake, almost like you are
right
baptized, you're being baptized.
You're being a good model.
You're being a good, role model. Here, I'm part of your community, but it's really for their sake, because you could just do this quietly.
Right.
But it's between.
Although again, that pushes, that's a fairly recent way to think. Again, because we come through rationalism and really in our culture, a hyper individualism, where faith gets reduced down to me and Jesus. When we read particularly the New Testament, but even Israel's scripture, it's always about a community, right? It's about the church. And that's why not only are you, when you do baptism, not only are you being incorporated into Christ, so you're now found in Christ, but you're being incorporated into the body of Christ. So in some ways, that baptism is your membership into the larger reality that is called the church, right?
I just always think like when they do big, large baptisms, sometimes it's intimidating. And I think it's often in the small community of your care group or whichever, the people that are going to do life with you.
Right.
That feels
right.
good.
Yeah.
To do a baptism versus, having thousands of people and walking up and I'm never going to know those
church might be receiving some critique there.
Yeah.
And rightly so.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, because we've moved to worldly markers of success, right? So we have to be big and huge and all that kind of stuff, but not necessarily. Good. And I'm describing things with a certain confidence and finality. I don't mean them to be final. I'm open to discussion. So I hope you're not feeling shut down by what I'm saying. I'm trying to give a counter perspective because I think a lot of times I try to be the most critiquing from within of my own tribe of evangelicalism. And I think there are things to kind of critique in that hyper individuality, seeing things like communion and baptism as mere signs. That's the other thing. You have a phone there, right? Can you just light up your screen for a second? Could you open it? So let me just move this camera. Okay, show the camera. So on the thing there, he's got little icons, right?
Podcast.
Right, a podcast. So how did you just open that?
Touch the screen?
What on the screen did you touch?
An app?
Yeah, an app.
So a picture, right?
Picture.
Yeah.
So that's what we would call an icon. Okay. So when we as moderns talk about a symbol, we have this divorce. There's the symbol and then the thing itself, and they're two completely different things. They don't touch. The way biblically and the early church understood symbol in reality was the symbol gave you access to the reality, right? So the same way that by touching that picture, you open up the world behind it. You access that new world by connecting, because the symbol for that world and the world itself are intimately related. That's how you access it. Baptism, the Lord's Supper, preaching is the same kind of symbol. It is intimately related to it. And that's what we mean when we say sacramental. Wesley would say, so the Moravian spirituality always wanted to wait for some work. And Wesley would say, yeah, we wait, but we don't wait doing nothing. Like we don't just sit there until the Spirit of God falls. God in his word has said where he's going to meet us. So while we wait, we do those things, grace channels that he has called us to do. And then we will receive what we're waiting for, right? Because there's a relationship. So when we're baptized, and Paul says you are baptized into Christ, you are joining with him, there is something spiritually real going on there. You are accessing. So in another place, Paul will say, we're seated in the heavenly realms with Christ. How is that so? Well, because we've been baptized with him, because we have joined him in his death, in his burial, in his resurrection. We've also joined him in his ascension. And even as he is seated, we are seated with him. That's why in the book of Revelation, the picture is of the saints, and why the revelation is to the spirit, the angel of the church of, and they have the 7 different churches, because while there is an earthly reality to the church, there is also a heavenly reality that corresponds to it.
I like to say, my understanding of sacrament is that I am inviting God to come through all of my defenses and work in me despite me. So even while I'm saying, no, I'm fine, I don't need you, I'm realizing that I say that to him 99.9% of the time. And the reality is that's not true. So I'll say, when I receive communion, I'm taking bread into me despite myself. And so he can then do what he wants to do. And often to my displeasure or dislike. So it's an act of recommitment on my part to being in relationship with it.
Okay. So the final kind of leaf in the practical conclusion, we have this eschatological note here. So the question is, why does God land in this enemy-occupied world in disguise, starting a sort of secret society to undermine the devil? Why is he not landing in force and fading it? So again, right, we don't meet Aslan. We hear about Aslan, you know, the confrontation is delayed. Is he not strong enough? And so Lewis says, well, there's coming a time when he is coming in strength, and this in-between time functions to allow people to know, because when God shows up, all resistance is overthrown instantly, right? I mean, I like Wendell Berry has a novel called Jayber Crow, and Jayber, this fictional character, wrestles with, why doesn't Jesus come off the cross? And part of that is because people that he loves has died in the war, and he wishes that God would just raise them up. So, you know, why doesn't God spare people this suffering? Why doesn't Jesus come off the cross? And then it dawns on him that if Jesus actually comes off the cross while everybody's watching, then God just becomes the biggest tyrant out there. Because once he does that, there's nobody that has any room for disbelief. And it's the same when God shows up, right? There's no disbelief anymore. There's going to be unconceivable love or unconceivable horror. And so when he comes, that is the wrapping up of all things. So that's what we mean by eschatology. But note, he's already said, God has made the material is good, and there's some form of material coming forward. So Lewis does not believe in the flesh-spirit duality that so many do. It's flesh, more real flesh. The real self is going to be revealed. And that's when we move from creation to new creation. So
you're moving toward, you're on a continuum, if you will.
Yes. Yes.
So what you're learning and you're doing and interacting and experiences, that just continues to further develop.
Yeah. Well, and again, he would say he alludes to it in here in the sermon that he called Weight of Glory. He kind of talks about it. We see it in the Great Divorce as well, that if we are heading toward God, we are becoming more and more real, more and more our true selves, more and more what we are created to be. But if we can be heading in the other direction too, and we become less and less our true selves, more and more a devil, right? And so, yes, as long as we're heading toward God, we are growing and becoming, but we can grow in the opposite direction as well, becoming more demonic and wretched all the time. So that, again, those who are in hell choose to be there because they have fled the presence. They have no desire for God. God would be a horror to them. if one of the reasons why Lewis doesn't believe in universalism is, imagine you have somebody who's a staunch atheist, wants nothing to do with God, is repelled by the very notion. To find that person, to find themselves in the heavenly presence of God for eternity, it's inescapable. That in itself would be hell. It would be torment. It would be torture. It wouldn't be joy. And the only way for it to become joy would be for God to destroy that person, right? That person would be unmade. And again, we're back to that, an automaton that has no capacity for love, therefore has no capacity to even desire to be there. God might as well have just made a rock and stuck it there, right? So yes, there's the capacity for growth and to continue to go further in and further up and to become more and more real as we pursue more and more God. And that's infinite, right? So we have all eternity, and there will always be more to God than what we can understand, right? Which means there will be always more reality, more life to enjoy and experience. And that's why that's what the contemporary conversations about heaven don't get, right? So I don't know if you've ever watched The Good Place, but The Good Place finishes, they finally get to the good place, which is their idea of heaven. And they spend a couple of, millennia just screwing around, having a good time, doing what they like, eating shrimp, whatever. But then they choose self-destruction in the end, because infinite, just amusing yourself is actually torment. Right? The idea that we will never grow tired. And it's not tennis courts and Corvettes, right? It's life with God that we will never get to the end of, because we can never get to the end of God, which means we can never get to the end of life. It's going to be so beautiful and diverse, and you haven't even seen a golden summer day yet,
We were talking about.
Yeah.
Gorgeous.
It's just going to be amazing. Who's got a time check for me?
A750.
750?
Yep.
Oh, we got tons of time. Guys, we're good.
That's because we're cooking right along.
Bob, I can see your lips moving.
Oh, can't hear me?
Give it to us.
Okay. No, I say that's why that it's so important, the relationship we have daily with Christ. It's not we're waiting till we get to the end and something miraculous is going to happen. We're going to go, hallelujah. I think though we can experience those hallelujahs daily.
Yes.
And when we're conscious of that, that's what makes that relation well worthwhile. It's like an appetite. I want more. It's what I desire.
Yeah.
So, how do you explain that to someone to whet their appetite, to say, when they may not be at that stage, they may be at a beginning stage, confusion, not knowing.
Right.
Please help. So I think on all of us through this journey that we're navigating, that relationship that we can tuck into, that's the sweet spot. That's when you hit the ball and it goes, it feels so right. When you have that with Christ, that's the sweet spot. But the devil's on us. He constantly wants to keep pulling us away, distracting us, pulling us right away from it, and saying, yeah, see, you shouldn't do that. So I think that's where the Screw Tape Letters comes in for me and goes, yep, that's where we're at.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Good.
that's what I just want to add.
Thanks, Bob. It was nice of Karen to give you a chance to talk. All right. So anything else that you want to note before we move into the book 3, just on that? And the large arc of that theology is creation, fall, or sin, new creation, right? Like that's the arc of the biblical story, creation to new creation. And that's basically what Lewis has covered. You know, he starts with epistemology. How do we know what we know? Establishes God in a natural kind of way, separate from scripture. And then he begins to kind of really rough out the broad brushstrokes of the narrative arc of the story of scripture, in which to start to understand some of these other pieces that he's going to move into. So it's fast, but he didn't have a lot of time, like he said, right?
Yeah.
In the original kind of discussions. And he's trying to speak to a very broad audience. So moving into book 3 then, and on the flip side of your paper is 12 chapters. It talks about morality, cardinal virtues, social morality, morality and psychoanalysis, sexual morality, Christian marriage, forgiveness, the great sin, charity, hope, and faith ×2. So again, is there anything as you read that stood out that you want to make note of? Questions that you had? Things that you would like to challenge?
Maybe those signs of truth and other, I thought of like the virtues, how much the Stoics talked about virtue and discussed. And
Yes. Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's not a word we use very often.
No, less and less every day. Yeah, for sure. And that is something to recognize too. Lewis is arriving through a particular route, right? As Christianity moves from, you know, the founding church were predominantly Jews, and had the Jewish thought form, although we need to be careful there too, right? Because there's no form of Judaism in the New Testament that wasn't also colored by Hellenism, which was the Greek thought forms and cultural forms of the day. But there was a Jewish kind of worldview and way of thinking there. As Christianity moves into the mainstream, it starts to be reframed from the Old Testament kingdom of God Jewish categories into the Greek way of discussing philosophy and religion. And so virtue, as you pointed out, is certainly part of that. What is moral? What is the good life? And so Christianity lines up with that. And so the early Christians would actually say, okay, so this was, again, it wasn't a bad thing because our gospel articulation is always enculturated. So if the culture is talking about virtues, then Christianity can say, okay, we will show you one, that Christianity, while different, is virtuous. And two, we will outlive you. If we can agree on what is the good life and these virtues, then we will show you that us being Christians can actually outlive you, outgood you, be more virtuous than you pagans as a result. All for the purpose of fostering faith, right? If this leads to the virtuous life, and that's what we're pursuing, then I will become a Christian. What does that entail? You start to have catechism. It's also why you begin to have a longer waiting period between belief and baptism. So we see in the New Testament, right? Philip is talking to the Ethiopian. Do you understand what you're reading? Explains it to him, opens up Isaiah to him, shows how Jesus is the Messiah, the one that was hoped for, and is the Redeemer and Lord of the whole world. Ethiopian says, well, look, there's some water here. Is there any reason why I couldn't be baptized and become a Christ follower? And Philip says, pull over, let's get her done, son. Baptizes him. Philip moves on. Ethiopian returns home. The later early church then, you have about a year wait time where you have some instruction, right? What does it mean to be a Christian? Again, because there does need to be some cultural translation. And then when it moves into the mainstream, you have about 3 years of instruction before you can be baptized, because there's a greater cultural gap that has to be spanned. So that's all a part of the kind of the shifts and changes and why practices changed in the church by region, because there's different needs, right? So how do we in culture and articulate the gospel in the language of our day, right? Because we're not talking virtue here. So how would we articulate it? And how does the translation change certain things, right? I mean, some of the friction that we have is the generations before us have always articulated it like this. If it's being articulated in new ways now, does that mean that we have ejected or are losing something that was before? Maybe. Was the thing that we're losing a part of the culture? Was it necessary and essential to the gospel? Or can that, it served its purpose back then, and now we can let go of that and start to articulate the gospel in some new forms now?
But I wonder what is always the catalyst of that change?
Right.
Like, is it slow moving in? All of a sudden there's this, I don't know, rebelliousness that goes this way, and then that becomes the, like,
Could be.
You know what I mean?
And likely, I always say there's no pure motives, right? So I would say there's probably a lot of different things happening. It could be a certain level of apostasy, could be a certain level of the culture encroaching into the church, could be that the church has recognized we've been articulating it this way since 1939, and it kind of hit a climax and it's been petering out, and we have basically plateaued and we're not seeing any. So maybe our articulation needs to be re-examined. Maybe the cultural shifts have happened and we need to start to let go of some of the modernity, the way we frame things then, hear the heart of postmodernity and say, can we begin to put it in those terms? Have we, the evangelical church kind of has the Christendom hangover. We have this memory and we want to keep getting back to that. Maybe we just need to let go of that and start to say, can we do this in new ways? And it could be all of that all at once, right? Because it's probably not very likely that there's just one thing going on. The church is so broad. And
it always seems like there's a bit of a breakdown in structure, right? In economics and politics, and all those pieces seem to be falling apart, whether it be war or a change or an ice age or whatever it was to cause that crisis of change.
Well, I mean, one of the crises that are happening right now is the falling of big name evangelical charismatic personalities. And other parts of the church are starting to say, guys, we can smell the bodies in the basement. Like something has got to change. We cannot just keep doing the same thing and expect different results. That's crazy.
Pulling up the next mega church
right
celebrity and hope that.
Right. Yeah. And keep saying, this is the model. This is success. This is faithfulness, right? Thousands of people with no intimate connection. And, like, is that what we're shooting for, guys?
Right. How's that working?
Sure is a crowd. If you don't use the right buzzwords, the
Right.
side eye of you're probably a heretic.
Right,
Because they
right,
didn't hear
right.
the
Yeah.
right words in the right order that
Yeah,
I
yeah.
attribute to.
And where's the
Orthodox
fog
belief.
machine?
Mhm.
Yeah.
How will they know that we are Christians without lasers?
And very, very loud praise teams.
Very loud praise.
Very loud praise teams. So that the children under 3 all have sound protectors on their ears.
Right, yeah.
My friend goes to
No,
a
I
church.
just want to
in
be
Toronto.
careful that we don't just start ripping, because there,
Mhm.
again, there is an attempt to do some enculturation there. So it's not
Yes.
all bad, internet.
No,
Mhm.
Saying
but at
there-
the same time,
And
there's
being small is not particularly holy in itself, right? Like,
not
Mhm.
just being whatever size you are is
Right.
just about perfect.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
you know, my girlfriend goes to church and her grandchildren all wear ear protectors
Mhm.
because the praise is so loud.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking,
God is very far away.
no, yeah, and you have
Gotta
to be
reach 'em.
very loud in order for him to hear you. And Sunday morning, you have to be even louder because everybody's trying to get in.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, but I think it's interesting a little bit though, like even like if we go back to the pandemic, how we all so desperately wanted to recreate these structures that we've created in these churches, whatever it is, big, small,
Mhm.
whatever,
Mhm.
but online.
Right.
But is that meeting a need? Because then people are not necessarily coming back.
Mhm.
But the other piece that I don't know, I always kind of wonder too, we have this global crisis. Where is the church?
Mhm.
In fear alongside,
Mhm.
right? And I kind of go, oh man, like often churches and communities of believers are the ones that went
Yes,
into where it was dangerous, into where it wasn't safe,
yes.
to be a hospital,
Mhm.
to care for people, love them, and so forth. And
Yeah.
worldwide, and I'm not pointing fingers, but I kind of like, where are we in our?
And I would guess there were stories like that,
I'm
probably
sure there was,
in
yeah,
the 2/3 world, which
for sure.
I don't think you're supposed to call the 2/3 world, but I think it's now the majority world.
But what is such a great opportunity to have, and I think there's stories that are going to come from out of that for
Mhm.
sure that we're going to hear.
Mhm.
But I think, what a great opportunity would have been
Right,
to love like, especially I think of the schools, like the mental health struggle
Right.
for those kids.
Yeah.
Where were the opportunities or places where we could have invested, open our doors and said, man, you're hurting.
Yeah.
Please come here. I'm
Yeah.
not going to be bombarded by, and I know there were rules. I get all of that. And that's not,
oh, yeah.
but
Yeah.
it just is
And I
like,
think,
oh.
again, yeah, I hear what you're saying. For me, part of the thinking was because of the level of fear, how are we a good neighbor in there, right?
Mhm, mhm.
And because there were churches that just said, we're not afraid, we're going to open up.
Sure.
And then it becomes this
Yeah.
fight for,
Yeah, then it becomes
for
political.
rights. And yeah, so,
Mhm.
and it should be political, right? I mean, again, we're talking about rulers, government, King Jesus. There's a politics of Jesus. So
Mhm.
I think your thinking is good,
Mhm.
for sure. I think that was a tricky
It was
one
so
for sure.
tricky.
But you're right. I
Totally.
mean,
I just think of the mental health.
and in some ways, we
crisis.
have the church in North America, because we established things like schools and hospitals and other social agencies. Those are the places you need help. You go to the agencies that have been established, right? And so
Mhm.
church has been, but once upon a time, and in a lot of the world, the church is the ones who are going to
Mhm.
respond and sacrifice themselves. And
Mhm.
yeah, you're right.
However, here we've responded in totally inappropriate ways. The actions of the church in Canada with the First Nations people has been totally awful,
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
absolutely horrendous, and never should have happened.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's not always doing anything,
Mhm.
because some things are obviously very, very damaging.
Mhm.
And he says somewhere, and there, he's talking about it would be killing Germans.
Mhm.
I think a lot of his stuff is coming out of the trauma of the war, really. But killing Germans, and therefore should we be mad at surgeons for killing cancer? That the morality of killing, you can't say killing is wrong, because there are many ways in which killing is good.
Mhm.
I can't remember if we ever resolved that or if we just threw it out there. But it struck me as.
It was that conversation of right and wrong.
Yeah, that was from the
Yeah,
first week
yeah.
with
I think it
him.
was the second.
Sorry,
I
this
think it
is the
was-
second week. That was from last week.
Yeah.
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 Mm-hmm.
That's okay. Bob, was your comment still relevant? Did you want to make it?
No, it's just the way we were talking, it made me think, well, do we really need a cross on our church? That's high on our agenda right now. We need to have that cross up there because, people driving by, they got to know what we are and all this, or do they know we are Christians by our love, type of thing. So, we can get caught up in lots of things that maybe we shouldn't be doing, or maybe we should be doing. And again, following the Spirit's leading and the fellowship of believers that say, yeah, let's go. There's wisdom in that, I guess.
Yeah.
Like Lewis talks a lot with these virtues about kind of growing up. Put away those little boyish things that you had and move on, And if you think this Christian stuff is an easy thing, give yourself a shake because there's more to it. I like that. He's challenging us right from the hop right there.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have little baby thoughts, and sometimes we need to grow up. We need to move. The pandemic was an awesome reset for the world.
Mm-hmm.
And did anyone have a game plan? Like you can point fingers every which way you want, but again, following God's lead and being patient and all these virtues that they talk about really came to light, because some of the churches really gave a bad name to the way they acted. And you feel sorry, they were doing it all for the right, and their belief for the right causes, making that stand. But I think they gave a black eye in a lot of ways. So what do you do in a pandemic? Trust the Lord. Be still. Know that he's God. All those things that come to us when we were gathering and encouraging one another. There's going to be lots of good stories that comes in the future. There's going to be books written about this pandemic and the beautiful stories and the way people served and did. And I think it's going to just continue. It's going to be history that's going to be unfolded for us. And we're living in it right now. It's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm.
Enough.
So as we go into book 3, he starts off with what I touched on earlier. He just talked about morality, but then again, relating that to the relationship with God, right? God isn't just snooping around to see if anyone's enjoying himself and trying to stop it, right? But rather that going with the grain, right? Like this is how the machine runs. And so again, the idea that this is about life thriving more than some arbitrary rules that God picked out of a hat. So we have morality being concerned with fair play and harmony between people. Also, kind of the tidying up or harmony within oneself, and then with the general purpose of human life as a whole, and that kind of the direction that God has for his creation. Do you agree with that? I thought the ships in
like the ships
formation,
Yes.
and the ships repaired, and the ships going to the right destination was just a wonderful kind of illustration. Eh?
Yeah.
Ships crashing into each other, or engines breaking down, or heading off the wrong way.
We did middle school with Lana Gummison at family camp for a few years, and she
Yes.
uses "don't get in the way." Don't get in the way of what's happening for others and for
Mhm.
yourself. And I thought it was sort of that ships in
Yeah.
line, like
Yeah.
kind of a point of morality versus I need you to sit, or the rules of
Right.
it. It was more like
Yeah, yeah.
that.
And nobody
directional-
understands why. Like, why'd you
Yes.
pick that one? Why is that
Yeah.
so bloody important?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I thought his point too, of reframing these discussions from just our 70 or more years to we are creatures that are destined to live forever. And so again, what we were talking about just a little bit earlier, right?
Mhm.
The direction that we are heading is going to keep going
Mhm.
either way. And so that importance for why this matters as much as it matters, I thought was just a
Yeah,
really
I
insightful.
suppose it depends on how much you believe you take with you into heaven.
Mhm.
I have no intention of wearing glasses in heaven.
Mhm.
But this implies that probably I will be.
I'm not sure where you would get that implication.
Well, when he's saying that if my temper is bad now, in just day to day, getting incrementally, so maybe you wouldn't even notice that in my lifetime, but over a millennium, you would notice.
So I
So
think
over
Lewis,
forever.
I think Lewis would want to make it distinguish between your frail human body, which is to be restored and renewed, and your soul. Because I think when he talks about your temper, that's your soul. That's not part of your
Oh, I would think
physical
that
makeup.
was not part of my soul, that would be part of my emotions.
So,
Very Greek understanding of that.
well, if you listen to somebody like Dallas Willard, your soul is the makeup of your emotions, your spirit. I forget what all he has in there, but yeah, I would put that in your soul. And I think Lewis certainly is saying these virtues are part of our soul.
Well,
And
then though, there's going to be no more crying, which would imply that my sadness is not going. So why would my anger go, but my sadness not?
sorry, say that again.
In heaven, there's no more sadness.
Right.
No more crying.
Right.
Why would my sadness not go to heaven with me, but my anger would?
I don't think your anger would. I think your anger would go with you to hell, is what Lewis is saying.
Could grow either way.
Because if you're entertaining it, if you're allowing that to run you, it's running you in the wrong direction.
I'm not sure that's what he said. I'll go back.
I'm curious about when we talk about that, just a little bit. It'll be such a gift for those that struggle. Like if you have bipolar or something like that, right? Some of those feelings that you don't really touch on a whole lot, and it's
Right.
hard to in the day-to-day here with life struggles.
Yeah. Well, again, I would see bipolar as part of the frail human body that would be renewed.
Okay.
So I don't
Like a
see
mental
that
health
as
versus-
an emotionalism. So I wouldn't necessarily see that, because that's, I don't know if it's a brain defect, but I mean, that's something that can be sorted with
Right.
chemicals, right? I think there's
Yeah.
some-
Sometimes, not
Chemical
always.
imbalance.
Not always.
No, and then that would go a fair bit of my anger these days is on my physical limitations. So once I don't have those physical limitations, then presumably I wouldn't have that anger. There would be other kinds of anger that I would have.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Although we did see in Great Divorce, we in our small group, we went through Great Divorce for 3 years.
Okay.
3 years, yes.
There is,
Could be experts.
you know,
Mhm.
there can be a hanging on
Mm.
to that sort of anger, right? Even though it was rooted in the body, you can still just become just a grumble. And again, I think that's part of his point there, that there's this trajectory. So you being angry over the state of your body can become so habitual that it bends the soul, so that when you have the opportunity to give that anger up, it's become so much a part of you. There's not enough left of you left. There's just the anger.
But
Which,
that would be presuming that you weren't working on it.
right. And I think he's talking about, again, when we talk about which way we're heading, that is the working on it, being virtuous.
It's hard to think through though when you know people who have struggled with depression, for example, who know Christ, but they are just stuck.
Yeah.
And we've known people who've taken their lives, right? Due to that.
Yeah.
And you go, they've tried so hard.
God knows they try.
Right. And you just kind of go, huh.
So again, I see that as physical.
Right.
I don't see that. So Victor Shepherd, in his Theology of the Human Person, has a great little phrase. He says, you know, we have to make this distinguish between mental health and spiritual condition, because too often, especially evangelicals, will conflate the two. And so not only do they have an illness then, but we also make them morally reprehensible.
Yeah. Totally.
And that's not the case.
No.
You know, somebody struggling with mental illness is struggling with mental illness.
Yeah.
That is not their spiritual condition.
Yeah.
And we should not say you just need more faith, that God will heal you, or any of that crap. Sorry, that was a little heavy. But we can push people's face in the muck, right? And again, Lewis, there's nobody in hell that doesn't choose to be there. There's nobody in heaven that doesn't choose to be there. Hell is a choice. Heaven is a choice.
And it's just in here and now where it gets messy and mucky.
Right.
Because their intentions, their heart, where their hope lies.
Yeah.
Right. Their actions might not always say it.
Yes.
Because it doesn't fit the framework of what we think should be.
Yeah.
And so it becomes messy. And then we give accolades or we say things, and I'm like, oh, no, let's just trust Jesus with this.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
But anyhow, it just feels real because we've had that circumstance in our family, and our son and struggles with that with a friend, and you just kind of go, no.
Yeah.
He loved Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, he did this. He did. Yes. Doesn't matter.
Well, and
we
again,
gotta trust that.
One of the dangers of reducing things down to a set of cold rules ripped out of context, just to say, you know, here's the handful of things that you can and can't do. And as long as you do or don't do those things appropriately, do and don't, then you're okay or you're not okay. Right. Yeah. And it loses presence of God as the source of life flourishing, the hope in the promise of renewal, the longing for, the waiting on the renewal of even this mortal body. It's sad. And then to say to people that are in that much pain, well,
how's your prayer life?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we've got a few more minutes. Any of the virtues stand out, or anything you want to talk about in any of these chapters? And again, you got a list there, possibly in front of you. Prudence, temperance, justice, fortitude. I thought he did a great job on talking on all of those. And I really liked the idea that somebody who is thoroughly wicked, trying to refrain from that wickedness, may be more moral than somebody who is generally good, that, you know, is so keeping their things that they've lost that sense of compassion.
Well, that's like the prodigal son,
Mm.
where you are, where the son,
The older
the
son.
stay-at-home son,
Yeah.
is so angry
Yeah,
because the prodigal son has been so horrendous
right.
and is now being so blessed,
Yeah.
where he's been good all along and nobody's blessing him.
Yes.
It's that same
Yes.
struggle.
And I was thinking in his discussion on pride that was Eustace, not Eustace, Edmund from Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, always comparing himself with Peter, wanting to feel superior to Peter. And pride really becomes the source of his fall and betrayal. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So on the second to last page of my book, chapter 2, I like point 3 that he says, we might think that the virtues were necessary only for this present life, that in the other world we could stop being just because there is nothing to quarrel about, and stop being brave because there is no danger. Now, it is quite true that there will probably be no occasion for just or courageous acts in the next world, but there will be every occasion for being the sort of people that we can become only as the result of doing such acts here. The point is not that God will refuse you admission to his eternal world if you have not got certain qualities of character. The point is that if people have not got at least the beginnings of those qualities inside them, then no possible external conditions could make a heaven for them. That is, could make them happy with the deep, strong, unshakable kind of happiness God intends for us. So again, that need to do moral formation now in order to even desire the good that is to be ours in the future.
It's an interesting one, not to go into great detail, but our girls, we had a conversation just this last weekend. We came back from my grandmother's funeral, and we were just talking about some of the observations they had made in different people, and how they said, we really appreciate how you have taught us to do hard things. In order to be, we have to dive deep into that bravery and be really uncomfortable, because they can see the antecedent of some of other family members who have had things easier done for them. And in so they seek pleasure, they seek affirmation in all the wrong things. And yet they still see themselves as Christians. But I remember I want to go to church, but they don't do the hard things. And the girls, like they're early teenagers, and they're seeing like, oh, there's adults that don't do brave and hard things. Because they want it to be comfortable. But then there's no growth to be seen or observed. I think it was a good conversation to go like, and my grandmother, I gave part of the eulogy, but that was part of it is, you just do hard things. Like just do it and trust that God's got you. Rather than have the most, what our society would say, will be comfortable, be easy, you know, you don't want it too hard. And they're like, I don't think that works. And I'm like, yep, that'll do you well. But
well, it does form a particular kind of person, right? Those habits. Yeah.
But just to even observe it, I thought, oh, those are pieces of character in others that have grown that and done things and took chances and dove deep into their faith of, oh, I don't know what this is going to look like, but I'm going to try. Versus those that stand on the edge and don't go. And I thought, oh, yeah, you do notice those intricate pieces of character, even from afar. So that when we read that out loud this week, I was like, how's our conversation?
Hey,
this weekend?
there it is. Now we're making
Yeah, we're making
connections.
connections.
This is the whole goal.
Reading comprehension is going well. Personal connections.
Yeah. Well, our time is 8:27. Anything that you have that just has to be said before we pray? Okay. That his discussion on what a Christian society would look like was interesting. There's lots of room for conversations. If you're ever wanting to engage in discipleship with somebody, that could be a good chapter to kind of read and talk about, and where are the limits. And, yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and then I'll pray.